right, we want to pick up where we left off last session. We were talking about physical development. We're looking at the early childhood years or preschool years. Let's do a real quick kind of review of some of the key points that we said the last time we met. Without looking at your notes, let's see what you might remember. What did we say about growth? Anyone remember what we said about just physical growth during this stage? Anyone at all? Not in terms of the numbers, just it's fairly steady. And what about males compared to females? Well, actually, the growth is about the same. Now, they come into this stage slightly larger. But in terms of the actual rate of growth, it tends to be pretty similar for both males and for females. And then there is fairly steady growth. Again, we talked about 5 pounds a year, 2 to 3 inches in height. Anyone remember what we talked about in terms of motor development, gross and fine motor skills? Again, just in general. Excellent. Gross is more developed than fine, and that continues to be the case really from stage to stage. Both show considerable improvement during this stage. The benefits of formal lessons to motor development. Anyone remember? Excellent. Again, for the most part, with the exception of throwing, formal lessons doesn't have a tremendous benefit to motor development. And again, that's not a statement about discouraging offering that, but to say that kids really need that in order to have normal development, not necessary. But there are some advantages to throwing. So excellent. And again, those were some of the key things that we were trying to emphasize. Again, we talked about balance, coordination, improving, learning some new skills. We had a couple things kind of left over. Preschoolers average about 7 or 8 colds and other respiratory illnesses a year. And this will drop off as we get to middle childhood. Which preschool children will probably experience more illnesses, and why? Those that attend daycare. There's a tendency, again, parents somewhat reluctant to leave kids home unless they absolutely need to, and so young kids tend to pass common illnesses around pretty frequently, and sometimes kids are taken back before maybe they're completely over a cold or a flu, and will pass it on to other kids. We also find, just as a side note, that teachers in those settings tend to experience an increased number of, again, illnesses, common cold, sicknesses, as a result of being around a group of children, many who are often, at least at the beginning stages of a common cold. Again, that will drop off when they hit middle childhood. A lot of that simply due to the fact that their immune systems are getting stronger. And finally, just to kind of emphasize, we've talked on a couple of different occasions about the interrelationship between the developmental domains. And again, it's important to understand that they are related. Emotional well-being of the child or emotional development will also impact physical development. And what we do know is that children who are in high-stress situations are more likely to experience increased illnesses, injuries, and in extreme cases can even affect physical growth itself in terms of impacting the production of GH, which is the growth hormone. So it actually can impact physical growth directly in some instances. And again, they tend to be not very common and tend to be extreme cases. But again, children who are growing up in high-stress, traumatic situations clearly impacts their sense of not only emotional development, but also impacts their physical reactions to those stress situations. And so, again, has physical component as well. We want to transition. We want to now begin to focus on cognitive development during the preschool years. What we want to first do is to kind of take a look at some common characteristics of preschoolers. I'm going to put a list up here in a moment, but when you think about, and again, particularly anyone who's been around 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, and some of you have had some experience, I think, with this age group, what are some terms that come to mind? How would you describe the typical preschooler? And again, you may not have had contact with this age group recently, and so you don't have a reference point. But if you do, what are some words or phrases that come to mind when you think about preschoolers? And some of you have some opportunities or experiences probably right now with this age group. Because I know some of you are over in the Child Development Center. Yeah?
So my son, he's 3.5, almost 4. His right now is I can't.
Interesting. Okay.
But he's curious and very independent as well.
Okay. Three terms there, very characteristic of curious, independent, and then some kids struggle with, again, as they're curious and wanting to develop new skills and new tasks, again, often have trouble understanding that we don't acquire those overnight. And so a lot of times when they experience some frustration over not mastering something right away, and then often will respond with, I can't do it. Eventually they master it, but initially they can experience some of that difficulty. Excellent. Other terms, phrases that you can... Everything is theirs. Excellent. And that'll come into play particularly when we talk about social development a little bit later on. World tends to evolve around them, and everything is theirs. And we'll talk some about that a little later on in terms of their perspective on the world as well. Excellent. Other phrases, terms come to mind. They tend to have short attention spans. In a moment, we'll find out that depending upon what they're involved in, it may be increased some. But they are a group that tends to kind of bounce around from one thing to the other, kind of focus on, now they may come back to it, very quickly. But tend to have fairly short attention spans, move on to something else that excites them, and just kind of float around, particularly if they have different opportunities to explore different things or be engaged in different types of play. Any other phrases, terms come to mind when you think about preschoolers, 3, 4, 5-year-olds?
Competitive between peers.
Okay, could be somewhat competitive. Sibling rivalry, particularly when you talk about home environments. And again, some of that comes back to that perspective of everything kind of being theirs, the world kind of evolving around themselves. Hard at this age to take on the perspective of somebody else. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Anything else comes to mind? Let's look at some, and clearly these are not all. I think this is and again, I guess I could actually say that every stage is a wonderful stage of development. I think this is a fun stage. It's an interesting stage in the sense that children at this age tend to have, again, given an appropriate, nurturing, stimulating environment, have a natural desire to learn and understand. Innately, they seem to be motivated to want to know, to figure things out, to understand this world that now that they tend to have somewhat more freedom and somewhat more mobility to experience. Now, again, that's providing that the environment is appropriate, again, to their age group, and that they're given the opportunity, to experience. And again, whether that's in a formal setting such as a child development center or just simply opportunities that parents or families provide for them. But for them, the world is a wonderful place to figure out, again, if given that opportunity. Now, the question I always ask myself is to figure out what happens, from this preschool age where kids seem to have this natural desire to learn simply for the joy of learning, and that somewhere along the journey, we tend to lose some of that natural desire to know just for the sake of knowing. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's an interesting question because this group, often we refer to them as almost like sponges, just literally wanting to soak up information and knowledge. So again, very natural desire to learn, to understand things. Something else, again, particularly as parents or if you happen to be in situations that you're working with a preschooler, real important to understand that they are fairly literal in their understanding of words and situations. I'll give you a couple of examples and then see if you can think of some things that adults, we tend to often be very symbolic. We'll use words, we'll use phrases that really represent something else and have symbolism that the young child often simply doesn't understand, doesn't catch. And they only catch the literal meaning. Simple example. It's probably about 2 years ago. I was with a group of preschool children, and we were going on a walk. It's kind of one of those nature walks. And so they were supposed to be looking for things. And so I was at the back of the line, and I simply made the statement to one of the children to keep your eyes out. And a little boy turned back and looked at me, just puzzled, and all of a sudden I realized exactly what I had said. And he was thinking, what? Yeah, how do I take my eyes out? Now I very quickly, and I changed what I said very quickly and realized, what he had interpreted that, and to me it was just a phrase to be on the lookout for things, but he had taken the literal meaning of what I had said and just looked so, now a lot of the kids were up in front of him and didn't hear what I said, but he just looked so puzzled, and so often we will make statements like that without realizing a lot of times how young children will interpret those statements. Something as simple as, I call home and I tell my son picks up the phone, he's 4 years of age. Tell Mom Dad's tied up at the office. What's the child think? I'm literally tied up. Mom, Dad's tied up in his chair. He's not coming home tonight. Again, literal interpretation of words. And we say them innocently, and all we're really trying to do is to convey that I'm going to be a little bit later. But you got to remember what the child sees in their eyes. True story. See if you can figure out what happened in this situation. It's kind of a combination of literal meanings, but it's also kind of the ways that children reason. It's actually a true story. It happened many, many years ago. Someone I knew had two children. One, and they were both girls, not significant to the story. One was a preschooler, and the other was a child who was a couple of years older. The older child was on one of those riding stationary bikes and had fallen off of it and I don't remember now whether it was an arm or a leg, but had broken a limb. And so the dad had taken the older child, to the doctor's office and had the arm, put in the cast and that kind of thing. And so the dad had come home and, the preschool daughter had asked Dad where her older sister was. And Dad said she had broken her arm or her leg and we had to take her to the doctor's. And the child simply began to cry hysterically. Now, be the preschool child, what do you think and the dad kept saying, it's all right, everything's okay. And the child just kept crying. What do you think the preschool child thought had happened to her older sister? Got to be the preschooler. Think about the words the dad had used. Any guesses?
She looked at her arm and her leg and she never came back.
You're on the right track. She did.
She went to the doctor and she never came back.
Why? Be the preschooler. What does broken mean to a preschooler? Huh? No, not in trouble. Again, be the preschooler. What happens when something gets broken? You can't fix it and you get rid of it. You throw it away. And that was her understanding of what, a toy gets broken, we throw the toy away. She literally thought her older sister had been thrown away. Because all she did was interpret broken, taken somewhere, and wasn't coming back. And then once Dad quickly figured out what was going on and why she was so upset, was able to correct her understanding. But again, young children will often interpret the meaning of a given word based on what their experience is, and then associate that or relate that to something else. Can anybody think of any other words that we might unintentionally say to a preschooler that would have literal meaning that could create some confusion for them? And I know that's hard to think on the spot. But there are so often things that we... I had a student one semester, and where it came from, but can remember someone actually saying, and again, if you think back, we've heard people say that, if you keep that, I'm going to hang you up from a flagpole, or some kind of a statement like that. Again, literal interpretations of words, and a lot of times kids do take the literal meaning, and yet we mean them symbolically. Preschoolers can become easily confused when a situation becomes too complex. I mean, obviously they have this great desire to want to learn and want to know and want to figure out things. And clearly one of the things that we want to attempt to do is to challenge them, to go beyond their current level of knowledge and understanding. However, it's important to find the fine balance, because if something becomes too complex, too difficult for them, then they can become easily frustrated. And then when they get really frustrated, then they're likely going to act out of that frustration. Can you think of an example of something a preschooler might be involved with? I'll give you one example. Maybe you can think of another one. Puzzles. Preschoolers love to put puzzles together. But if they run across a puzzle that's just simply too difficult, pieces are too small, the connections are too complicated, and they can't figure... I was watching a couple just the other day in the office trying to put a puzzle together, and it was a hard puzzle, And it was just, you could watch the frustration kind of growing in trying to put the pieces together. Can you think of any other examples of something that a preschooler might be involved in that if it was too difficult may create more frustration than the joy of learning? And that's where it goes back to the appropriateness of the environment in the situation. Anybody think of any other examples?
Board games.
Some board games. Particularly, and again, preschoolers tend to not to be overly concerned about the rules, but if you're trying to play by the rules and the rules are too complicated to remember, they will become easily frustrated. And they'll make up their own at that point, but board games. You have a young child who likes balls and shooting balls, and they're trying to shoot a basketball in a goal that's too high, and they just simply don't have the physical strength to get it up there. After a while, it can become really frustrating for them. And that's why, again, we see a lot of them that have been created to be able to be lowered at a level that they can easily, shoot it in there, and to feel the satisfaction from accomplishing it, and then gradually rising that as their strength and skill levels improve. Sometimes working with small items, where you're trying to work. I notice that young preschoolers particularly really like to work with beads and stringing beads. But again, making sure that it's not too small, to where they actually can maneuver that, comfortably. And then it can become too complicated, and then they'll get frustrated and either give up or just simply get more and more, frustrated. Preschoolers often trying to swing a bat, and again, trying to swing, if they've got one that's really big with an extremely large ball where the chances of success are pretty high, then it can be very rewarding. But to take a very thin bat with a really small ball where the odds of them really being able to coordinate eye, hand, and coordination with the ball that's coming can be very frustrating and very difficult. So again, it's a matter of challenging them to improve their skills, but then making sure something's not going to create frustration simply because they're unable to master it at that point. They tend to be fairly rigid in their ideas of what should take place and when. And again, can become very easily frustrated when things fall out of what they believe their world should be. Again, one of the characteristics, one of the things that we find that tends to be true for preschoolers as a general rule, not in every case, is they like order. They like patterns, and they like consistency. Why? What's it provide for them? Stability and security. There is comfort in knowing. And why is that particularly important, do you think, at this stage? And so what really relates to the first one. They have this natural desire to want to learn, to want to understand and to know things. But what does the stability provide for them? Sense of security, exactly. Which then allows them to feel more comfortable, more free to explore that which tends to be somewhat less known. If it's happening within an environment that feels very secure, very safe, and very predictable. And so again, they like to know, and they like that to stay pretty consistent. And again, it doesn't mean they can't adjust and adapt, but they need to know ahead of time in order for them to make that mental kind of adjustment. Again, even something as basic, the child is used to watching Barney at 10 a.m. in the morning and tends to do that most days, and looks forward to that. And then all of a sudden, there's a need to change that schedule. And if you walk into that child, it's 10 o'clock that we just did that famous opening Barney song, and then all of a sudden we say, we've got to go to the child. What is the child likely going to do? Huh? It's going to throw a fit. Exactly. Because that's not what we do. That's not the routine. That's not the pattern. Here's what we do. And you'll see that, in other settings too. Again, when that routine gets shifted, get altered, because they get used to this is the way things are. And when they get it in their minds the way something is, then that's the way it should be. Even if it's not logical, in terms of even some of the things that they believe or what they believe about how something occurred or happened, then they're convinced that that's the way it is. And again, tend to be fairly rigid. Don't change their minds real easily. Doesn't do a lot of good to argue. And it also doesn't do a whole lot of good with this age group to provide a lot of logical reasonings to try to attempt to change their mind. They're pretty set. And I don't know if anybody, if you do, can think of any examples. You've got a child in that age. Yeah, children want to know when they're going to get picked up, who's going to pick them up, what's going to happen afterwards, and particularly if there's any change, in those routines, in those patterns. And one of the things to be thinking about over the next couple of days, because we're going to be talking about it, is to think about other things that you can think about in terms of how this age group sees and understands things, because it's interesting because they have their own perspective on how the world works. I mean, they're figuring it out and learning about it, but they tend to have their own theories about how things work. And once they've figured out their theory, they're pretty set that even if it's incorrect, that they know. Again, for those that have worked with this age group, can you think of some activities that have engaged a child's attention span for a much longer period of time? Because one of the things that happens is this age group does have the ability to focus on something for a long period of time if it's something that they're really interested in. And there are some things that tend to do that for certain kids. And particularly if it's an activity or something that doesn't occur frequently or is unusual or different or new. And it's interesting, I believe I read in the paper this morning that the Jones Farm was opening up, I believe today.
Yeah, we're actually offering out of the classroom.
You're actually taking the group out there, which makes it kind of, and again, it's interesting how you put them in a different structured situation in their attention span. And you could bring a pumpkin into the classroom, and probably 5 minutes, 10 minutes is the most they're going to focus on that. But then take them out to the farm, which is a whole new experience, half hour, hour or longer, and tend not to lose interest at all in pumpkins. Anyone think of any other examples? I've watched kids who are fascinated with puzzles and put puzzles together, for long periods of time. And even the same puzzle. I mean, I've been amazed to watch the same child put the puzzle together, take it apart, put it back together over and over again for what seems like an endless amount of time. Others who have worked with this age group think of activities that some kids have been engaged in or will do for a long period of time. Yeah.
My nephew and I would color, and if anything else, we would color for like an hour at a
Yeah.
time. And his attention span was very short for everything else.
Excellent example again of for some kids. And some kids color for 5 minutes and that's enough. Other kids, my son was fascinated with coloring, and he could sit and color either something specific or just do stuff with colors, on paper. And there's some kids that will simply do that for hours on end and never seem to get bored with it. And like you said, have a relatively short attention span with everything else or many other things. Any other quick examples that you can think of? Yeah.
I babysat a couple boys, 3 and 4, and one of them liked to swing on a swing set all the time, and he had me push him for like an hour.
Yeah.
And the other one liked to ride in his motor car around in circles.
Yeah, one riding a motorcycle kind of thing around and swinging. And it's interesting, you take another child and 5 minutes on that swing and they're bored, and yet you have another one who could do it for an hour. And my guess is you were probably fairly worn out, wondering when is he going to get tired of this swing? And again, and a lot of it's simply individual differences. I've watched kids with building blocks, just build cities and towers and play in those blocks. And if they could spend the whole time doing that. I've watched other kids and again, a lot of it's balanced. Some's good, some's not so good. But I've watched other kids who can sit at a computer screen, for hours on end and never move, in terms of the stimulation they get, with that. So again, attention spans tend to be short. You'll often see kids bounce around from different activities pretty frequently. But if it's something that they're really interested in, they can do it for a much longer period of time. So again, generally speaking, it's true, but they can focus a lot longer than we think. This age group is not overly concerned with reality. So their worlds and their expressions are often very inventive and imaginative. And again, I think this is one of the fascinating things about this age group. And you see this a lot in their play. They create visual characters. I already mentioned earlier in the semester that my son at this age was very much into action figures. And so he created very elaborate scenarios with the action figures. And had major sporting events taking place. And I mentioned this earlier as well, but we would go to the restaurant. We'd be sitting down trying to order or look at the menu, and he's moving everything off the table. And he was creating salt pepper shakers with the goals, and anything that was sitting there was another object. And he would bring his hockey players, his little hockey figures. And he would sit there on the table, and then he would say, would you please move your plate? It's in the way of the field. And he would hit, whether it was the cap off the ketchup bottle or something, and hit it back between other objects. And he would play a hockey game. And he would much rather do that and that was at a stage when he wasn't always eating a whole lot, and he would rather do that than eat. And he could create that scene with all kinds of things almost anywhere. He had just a very vivid imagination that came out, in his play. Anyone else think of examples of children's imagination and their creativity? I've watched lots of kids in terms of what, not only action figures, but stuffed animals. And stuffed animals literally coming to life and playing out scenarios with the stuffed animals and talking to stuffed animals. And for those kids, in a lot of ways, it appears to be very, very real for them. Anyone else think of examples of the imagination of this age group? Yeah.
He would have his action figures, like you're saying, but he would go through the actions like he could pull himself like, stunt double would, for all the actions, and he just had this virtual reality going on where he knew, like, this guy is here and he's getting hit, but then this other person hits him this way. He just had this imagination that was so cool.
And again, one of the words you use is kind of that virtual reality that he created in his own world. Mm-hmm. And was he a part of what was going on?
Oh, yeah, totally. Everything was going on, and something was going on over there. So as soon as he was done here, he would just,
The action figures tackle you or something, and then you tackle the action figure. I mean, you're a part of what's going on, and the action figures almost become real life. You're looking at this little bitty miniature figure and figuring out what in the world's going on, but for them, it is virtual reality, for them. Anyone happen to have an imaginary friend? No, I usually, of course, classes are larger. Often I have someone who's had an imaginary friend.
My daughter did.
Your daughter did.
Yeah, she's 9 now, but when she was about that age, it was.
Do you,
I can't even remember what she named this imaginary friend, but it was always their fault.
they were the cause of everything. And again, if you haven't had one, it's hard to identify with it. But again, and there's nothing to be concerned about with imaginary friends. Now, if you still have an imaginary friend and you're 21, then maybe something to be a little concerned about. But at a preschool age, it's not uncommon, it's unnormal. And probably the best thing to do is just to kind of go with it. But it is fun to watch kids who have imaginary friends because for whatever reasons, it's pretty real-like. I mean, I've known of situations where you've got to set a place at the table, for the imaginary friend, and you got to make sure that you put food on the imaginary friend's plate, The funny thing is in the cars, I mean, I've heard, people say, you can't sit there. You just sat on him or her, Him and her is upset with you, Or as you were saying, not uncommon in terms of your daughter, it also becomes convenient that when you've gotten in trouble, it wasn't my fault. It was Emily or whoever they imagine. She made me do it. Or she did it. It wasn't me who broke that. I didn't eat that cookie, so-and-so did. And again, and they tend to be short-lived. It probably doesn't gain a whole lot by trying to convince them that imaginary friends aren't real. It's probably a lot easier just to go ahead and kind of play along with it and realize that will probably soon pass as well. If I had one, I don't remember having one, but I almost always have a student or two who've had imaginary friends growing up. And a lot of times it's kind of interesting because they still remember who it was and can remember stories and things they did with their imaginary friend. So even though the imaginary friend is not real, they still have a reference for it. Yeah, Jason.
Do they actually see somebody there, or is it just?
That's an excellent question. What they actually see in their minds, I don't know. I don't know. If you were to ask them, they would probably tell you yes. Now, do they visually, see them? Probably not. It's probably, again, the imagination creating a mental image, in their minds more than a reality. Because remember, it's the imagination for them that's real, not the reality. That's an excellent question, and I wish I knew a better answer to it. But like I said, I bet if you were to ask, do you see your imaginary friend, they probably will say, I don't know if your daughter, may not have been a question you ever thought to ask. My guess is they would say, yeah, they're right there. You can't see them? Kind of thing. So, but again, nothing to be overly concerned about or worried about at all. Again, with this age group, some children are frightened by things that look real but are not. Halloween. I will never forget. Matthew, preschooler, trick-or-treating in the neighborhood, and he was getting to the upper end of the preschool years where he was becoming more and more independent. And so, when they're really young, you have a tendency to kind of go with them to the door, So now we're at the point where the child is saying what? Well, he wasn't saying he wanted to go. He was telling us to stay on the curb. You stay on the curb, and I'm going to go up to the door. I'm doing this myself. And we went up to this one house, knocked on the door, he opened it, and some adult had one of the scariest masks on. It was dark all around it, opened the door, and screamed. And I mean, you want to see a kid head for the curb in 90-0. And I mean, he was a while overcoming that one. I mean, adults have to be really conscious of who's trick-or-treating. With older kids, that would have been really funny. And I think probably what happened was because he had chosen to go on his own, probably made the assumption that he was an older child than he really was. And I mean, just scared the dickens out of him, And that was pretty much the end of trick-or-treating that night, kind of thing. But again, Halloween, a lot of things, particularly now, because things become so much more real-looking than they used to in the past, and particularly with masks and Halloween costumes. And again, for really young children, they can be extremely frightening. Can you think of other examples of things that can be frightening to this age group? Huh? Certain movies. Again, a lot of difficulty separating out fantasy from reality. What else? Think of any other examples. It's interesting that, we think that and whether, again, it has to do with real versus fantasy or not, but, we think that all young children should be fascinated with the characters at the mall during certain holidays and seasons. But what do you find with a lot of preschoolers? What scares them? Santa. Or every once in a while at Easter time, you'll have some giant bunny walking around, greeting kids, freaking out. Anybody ever go to any of the Missouri State, I'm going to use basketball because that one's the more real. What's the name of I should know this, our bear? Is it Boomer? Did I get that right, Boomer? I sit up kind of in the stands without the backs, and Boomer wanders around up there a lot, and it's interesting to watch some of the kids just freak out. I'm talking preschool kids, not real little kids, and Boomer's trying to approach, and they're, not sure exactly what Boomer is, And so some of those characters, clowns, a lot of times will really scare preschool children. And, and everybody says everybody loves a clown. Well, one of the things we find is not all young children, not all older adults, tend to have that same admiration, for clowns. So again, there are a lot of things that appear real, but can be very frightening to children. I was in a large city at one of the science museums. And again, every place I go, I watch. I watch people, I watch children. And this particular science museum on the East Coast had one of these giant dinosaurs, real life-size kind of dinosaurs, or relatively life-size dinosaurs that moved. And it was interesting just to watch the preschoolers as they approached the dinosaur, and as soon as that dinosaur said, it kind of go up there, and then the head would begin to move down like this, kind of towards where the kids were standing, and you could watch him begin to back up, and what they weren't sure what. If it was real or not, because from where they were standing, it looked pretty real, and it was moving, and it took a while for them to really sort out how real or unreal this dinosaur, was. Probably one of the funniest ones. And again, fantasy, reality, it's hard to know. But this was a number of years ago during Christmas time. I was in Toys R Us, and they've come out with so many of the motorized figures. I saw one the other day, and I can't remember now what it was, but it was pretty good size. That your remote controls. We had a remote control dog, and somebody had picked up the remote control and was kind of away from the dog, and some young child came up, and so this other kid obviously did what? Started to work the remote control and push the buttons where the dog barks, and moves and stuff, and it was just funny to watch this young preschool child looking at, trying to figure out, this thing's moving, it's barking, is it real, is it not real? And most of their experiences were in Toys R Us. These are toys. But again, everything's becoming more lifelike, and resembled more of a real dog than would have ever in the past. But the fact that the child that was watching this toy motorized dog couldn't see, the remote control that was operating, or that something was, he only saw, this object, up on this kind of stack of shelf, moving and barking, and again, and can be frightened by those things again that look real, even though that they're not.
Something that's kind of combined with imagination and being frightened
Mhm.
of things like monsters under your bed and stuff. Like I remember I used to think I had alligators under my bed.
Oh,
and I
yeah.
would jump from my bed to the hallway, or I'd get eaten if I touched my carpet. Like I was so scared. I hated it.
Exactly, and it's
I remember stuff like that.
just a combination both of imagination, and what prompts those things, I'm not sure we always know. Yeah, and then gets triggered with not only our imagination, but then with our fears that become real. And parents, what are we notorious for trying to do is to convince you that it's not real, there's nothing there, and so we look under the bed with you and say there's nothing there, but as soon as we turn those lights out and leave, it's back. Yeah, it's back. I know it's there. It's got to be there. And probably, in many cases was prompted by something that you had seen, could have been something on a TV show or whatever, that kind of generated a bad dream. And again, the dream becomes, which for all of us, at some level, dreams are real. Yeah. Now, when we get old enough to cognitively know that they're not real, but it doesn't make the moment of the experience of the dream not feel real. And then it gets more difficult to separate the reality from the fantasy, and particularly when, again, we're very, very young. Again, good example of a combination of that emotional experience with the imagination. And then it's amazing what some of the kids come up with. The boogeyman. I don't know what the history is on the boogeyman and where the boogeyman came from, but many children of boogeyman's been in their room someplace, hiding out. And I remember as a kid, and then again this dates me, but I remember when E.T. first came out, and E.T. was an interesting, character. Yeah, and you can just imagine if you were a young child, and you opened up the door, and all of a sudden, of which everybody else was convinced could not be real, kinds of things. So again, some children clearly are frightened by things that look real, but are not. Where we want to go, really, and it's too late, I think, to start this now, but what we're going to do is take a look at the next stage of cognitive development, which is pre-operational. Pre, typically, it means before. Operational is referring to the logics or the logical order of things. And so we often talk about before logic, or a child has difficulty thinking in an operational way, a logical adult sequence of how things happen. It doesn't say that this age group doesn't have logic. They clearly do. But they tend to have their own. And it doesn't necessarily always apply the principles that adults would apply to a given situation. So, again, the first stage of Piaget was, just a quick review, sensory motor. Excellent. Where children learn through their senses and their motor abilities. The key word you want to remember when we start our next discussion, and when we move into pre-operational, is where we left off in the previous stage. And what you want to think of is symbols and symbolic thinking. A lot of what is key is the transition. It doesn't mean that sensory motor, we're still learning through our senses. We're still learning as a result of our motor abilities. But now what we're adding to that is understanding symbolic thinking. And we'll illustrate that during our next session. But that's the word you want to underline, highlight, hold on to, because that's a key word for understanding this next stage. And like I said, we'll go into some of the characteristics of that next time.